Hey everyone, what's up? Jubitaz back with a new video, where today we're gonna take a look at a topic that a lot of you have shown a lot of interest in. One thing that many Naruto fans like about the series is how it mirrors our real world in many aspects, be that war, militarism, or even propaganda, which means information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. Now, I already have a plethora of videos out there that question the political nature of the Leaf Village, so this isn't a new topic by any means, but I figured that today I might as well directly address or expose the Leaf Village's propaganda, also known as the Will of Fire, which the citizens of the Leaf interpret as treating Konoha as family and putting your life on the line to protect it. But in practice, it's the devotion to an authoritarian military regime, where you sacrifice the most vulnerable to keep those in power protected. This will be a deep analysis of the slogan or propaganda of the Will of Fire, the village system, its bad actors, and the historical figures that helped put it in place. Now, if videos like this sound like your cup of tea, then be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and other than that, let's get straight to the meat of this video. So the Will of Fire, despite being viewed as an honorable slogan, could also be seen as state propaganda. We only see it as a positive because the story is told from the Leaf's perspective. One of the reasons that Naruto's villains come off as so redeemable and morally complex is that despite their actions or how many people they've killed, a lot of them usually have some grandiose plan for peace, and they're fighting against the system that's inherently flawed, that being the shinobi system, where every shinobi was basically a killer for hire. The propaganda is a lot more apparent to characters like Pain, Sasuke, or Obito, people that were victims of the Will of Fire, whose loved ones had to be sacrificed for the overall stability of the Leaf Village. Meanwhile, the citizens of the Leaf are brainwashed to an extent and just blindly follow the propaganda they're fed by their superiors. An example is when Sai joins Team 7 and calls Sasuke a traitorous cockroach for abandoning the village and going to Orochimaru, without knowing that it was his boss that indirectly caused all of that and was behind a lot of tragedies both within and outside the Land of Fire. That's the purpose that propaganda serves. It makes your citizens believe that they have the moral superiority and can talk down to others even when they're the ones in the wrong. Sai is actually a perfect example of a victim of propaganda. When he was first introduced, he was just a tool for Danzo to use and wouldn't ask any questions when Danzo assigned him with clearly immoral assignments like his hit list that included Sasuke, or even sharing classified intel with a villain like Orochimaru. He believed that despite the lengths he'd go to, Danzo always had the Leaf's best interest in mind, so somehow that justified all the sketchy assignments he handed out. And it's Naruto that pulls him out of this a bit and encourages Sai to think for himself. Naruto, even though he believed in the Will of Fire, he still had empathy and a moral compass, and that's why he was able to sympathize with characters like Pain and Sasuke, for example. When Naruto defeats the Diva Path and is on his way to meet the real Pain, he runs into Shikaku and Inoichi on the way and tells them that he's going to talk to Pain, and Inoichi loses his shit. There's no talking to him, you see what he did to the village? Not interested at all in finding out why Pain would do such a thing. That is one consequence of the Will of Fire. It assumes that the village is perfect and that nothing could ever justify any attack perpetrated against it. However, Naruto was stunted by Pain's cycle of hatred and would have felt like a hypocrite if he became a part of the cycle and just killed Pain for vengeance. Inoichi represented the arrogance that resulted from the Will of Fire, which was the reason that Pain destroyed the village in the first place. When Pain went to see the Hokage, he tried to reason with her and believed that they were on the same moral ground, that the attacks he'd just launched against the Leaf were nothing compared to what the great nations did to his hometown. However, Tsunade more or less dismissed his point of view. Despite acknowledging that not everything the Leaf Village did in the past was just or correct, Despite having been damaged by the system herself and having to deal with bad state actors like Danzo and the elders on a daily basis, acknowledging the threat that the conservative old heads of Konoha represented, she still downplayed the damage caused by Konoha, which enraged Pain and angered him enough to flatten the entire village. The truth is that Tsunade was a victim of this system too. She lost all her loved ones to the Will of Fire, the slogan that encouraged individuals to throw their lives for the betterment of their village, and she gave up on the system until Naruto and Jiraiya emotionally manipulated her and forced her into a role she wanted nothing to do with at first. The Will of Fire may have sounded noble on paper, but in practice it was very flawed, and self-contradictory in a sense. You can almost call it layered propaganda, because while it's supposed to protect the inhabitants or those that are most vulnerable in Konoha, the overarching meaning of the slogan was to protect the Leaf Village as is. Despite the third Hokage saying that we have to protect the king, and the king being the next generation that would inherit the Will of Fire, it was this same generation that was thrown into life or death scenarios like Obito and Rin, for example, or burdened with maintaining the balance of this flawed system by themselves like Itachi Uchiha. Despite calling for the protection of all those in the Leaf, when the White Fang Sakomo put his mission on hold to save his Leaf comrades, he was shamed and disgraced by everyone in the Leaf because he put the individuals over the state, and even those that he'd saved smeared him. This is one example of why the Will of Fire didn't work that well in practice. That is, unless it was just propaganda, then it did its job perfectly. It was a slogan that encouraged and low-key brainwashed soldiers to die for their state, which is portrayed as such a heroic action or noble move, leaving their loved ones behind to mourn their loss and turn against the system, almost unknowingly wasting their lives to maintain the status quo. The biggest flaw with the system was, it was designed in a way that if a corrupt or selfish state actor rose to power, they could send others to die on their behalf while they hid from the consequences of their actions. This was the case with Danzo and the elders to a lesser extent. Danzo was a self-serving politician that cared about his own seat of power and relied on manipulating others through propaganda, using the cover of protecting the Leaf, aka the Will of Fire, to have his way and get away with his schemes. The biggest issue was, despite all those around Danzo acknowledging that he and his methods were dangerous and untrustworthy, they pardoned him because of this narrative that he always had the safety of the village on his mind. He embodied the darkness of the village, and what they failed to acknowledge was that even though he may have cared about the village's well-being occasionally, his main priority was saving his own ass. He constantly screwed and used those around him, and in turn created many enemies for the Leaf. And afterwards, he used the propaganda to paint those that turned against the Leaf as the evil ones. The two advisors, Koharu and Homura, were in the same boat. They normalized Danzo's crimes and usually agreed with his hardliner right-wing stance of using whatever means to protect the village, no matter what moral lines get crossed. At least the third Hokage was critical of Danzo's methods, but even he's partially to blame for the resulting propaganda of the Will of Fire. He enabled the system of impunity to rise, and while he was sympathetic, his voice was usually drowned out by the three other conservative voices in the council. If we look at the Uchiha incident, for example, while it was a complicated ordeal and the Uchiha may have threatened the stability of the whole village, their demands weren't unreasonable. They were unfairly despised and treated with contempt. The Itachi novel adaptation makes the Uchiha sound more reasonable, that a civil war was their last resort, but their pride in their clan made them a threat to the Will of Fire, and the Elder Council refused to meet them halfway. They still blamed them for the Nine Tails incident. The third Hokage wanted to give the Uchiha the benefit of the doubt and resolve the conflict in a peaceful manner, but the others had a more draconian approach. They wanted to remove the Uchiha threat altogether, and Danzo exploited Itachi's utilitarian nature and gave him this ultimatum: either join your clan and endure the civil war which will bring harm to everyone, or annihilate them yourself and you get to save your little brother. Itachi is a prime example of how propaganda can be used to serve the state at the cost of those that oppose it. He was coerced into eliminating everyone in his clan under the belief that if he didn't, there would be more resulting casualties, not even giving him the chance to negotiate because Danzo took that away from him. The two elders, Koharu and Homura, while they didn't give the order, they still approved of this idea of committing unspeakable acts just to protect the village without having to get their own hands dirty. Only Hiruzen felt regret and shame, but even he didn't do much. He stalled on the negotiations, and he's the one that allowed Danzo to have that much power in the first place, despite knowing about his methods. Hiruzen tried to right his wrongs by removing Danzo from the council once he found out about his order to Itachi, but by then it was too late, and Danzo just took his foundation agency and went underground. It's not like he faced any real repercussions or was actually removed from power. He still had a hold over the advisors. The village system, the oligarchy, and the elders in particular relied on this will of fire propaganda to maintain the status quo, and the Uchiha were a threat to that. Anyone that opposed the will of fire was. This was the ugly side of this indoctrination, the blind protection of Konoha, and the resulting favoritism of those that are already in power, those that barely ever set foot into the battlefield and just sat comfortably in their chambers issuing fundamentalist or militant orders to protect their own grip of power, protect their idea of the village, as they were used to it. They were also quick to judge anyone that had grievances with the village. Danzo was a more extreme case. He manipulated all those around him to get his way, which didn't necessarily align with what was best for the village anyways. And Danzo often used the two elders Koharu and Homura to get around the Hokage's authority. Hiruzen may have had a more noble idea of the will of fire in his mind, but he failed to implement that, just like its founder, the first Hokage, failed. Hashirama is the one that coined the term the will of fire, but he didn't foresee the resulting elitism and the propaganda that it would be used for, even if he unintentionally laid the groundwork for it. When he killed Madara, Hashirama said that whether it was a friend, brother, or his own child, he would never forgive someone that harms the village, and this exact reasoning would become the will of fire. Hashirama had empathy to pair with his teachings, but his successor, Tobirama, the second Hokage, wasn't like that. He strengthened the militant nationalism of Konoha. He believed that the village should be held above all else, and saw his brother's kindness as naivete. It was also his students that would go on to become the oligarchs that preached this will of fire, and Danzo used the second Hokage's teachings to justify his stance against the Uchiha clan. Tobirama's no-nonsense belief that everyone should submit to the village's authority would indirectly lead to the system that could be abused by the higher-ups, that would use its shinobi as tools and toss them aside like garbage afterwards. This vague statement of protecting the village can easily be exploited as a propaganda tool to protect the establishment of the Leaf. Hashirama had finally realized the flaws in the system he created that resulted from it once he was revived by Sasuke Uchiha and was told about the Uchiha massacre and Sasuke's vendetta. He may have praised Itachi's actions, but he only praised the sacrifices he made in an attempt to maintain peace. He at least acknowledged that the system he created to protect children from dying on the battlefield has failed, unlike Tobirama, who arrogantly refused to acknowledge his contribution to the village's darkness, and how the jutsu he created in the name of science was used to cause so much pain. Hiruzen admitted to his failures as the Hokage, that he burdened Danzo with the shadowy works of the village. However, he stops short of blaming Danzo, which raises an issue. Since these three are the founders of the current village system, they all treated the Uchiha massacre as a tragedy that had to happen to protect the village. That this was the unfortunate but inevitable course of action, even if it resulted in wiping out one of the four noble clans of the Leaf. Even if that weakened the Leaf's military, as long as the village system was maintained as is, then that's all that mattered. And that it was after hearing all of that, how the system failed, that Sasuke decided to reform the shinobi system and bring about a revolution. That's why Sasuke is such a complex and compelling character. He raises questions and challenges ideas that Naruto either can't or won't confront, adding a much needed layer of complexity to the story. His former teammates looked down on him and his actions and thought that he was a joke for suggesting that he'd become the Hokage, but who were they to pass down judgment? They were all puppets of the propaganda that had no idea of the Leaf's dark past or what their precious village did to his clan. None of them spoke to the first Hokage to get insights on how the village was formed or how it failed. That's why Sasuke says it doesn't matter what any of them think, because they were all oblivious to the truth. So why would their opinion matter anyways? They all glorified a system that didn't work, or worked for a select few and at the cost of many others. That's what the Will of Fire was. The only person that was willing to acknowledge Sasuke's point of view and not just view him as some rogue faction was Naruto, and even he couldn't change the system that caused him so much pain. All Naruto said was that he didn't want Sasuke to tackle all of this alone, but he didn't really present him with an answer to the problems with the shinobi system. Their best bet was for the both of them to become the most powerful beings on Earth and keep an eye on the world to ensure that people don't endure the same tragedies they faced as children. So, was the Will of Fire a propaganda tactic? Well, maybe that's not how it was intended to be at first, but it surely grew to be just that. Especially when the Elder Council was in charge, when Danzo used the excuse of "I'm doing what's best for the Leaf" whenever he wanted to justify his sketchy actions. That was propaganda. When he framed the Uchiha conflict as a us versus them conflict that couldn't be prevented in any other way than massacring the entire clan. That was also propaganda. When he refused to use any tools in his means to negotiate, because he didn't even try. He wanted the Uchiha gone for good, so trying to frame them as unreasonable was just a way to push his own agenda along. And while he's the one that gave the ultimatum to Itachi, a portion of the blame lies on those that enabled him, like Koharu and Homura, and those that were aware of his actions, like Hiruzen. Koharu and Homura may have not given the order, but they agreed with the idea that getting rid of the Uchiha clan was for the good of the village, despite them being a part of the village. What? Just because they showed a little resistance, it wasn't even worth trying to reason with them? What was this village that they were trying to save? Who qualified to be a part of it? When pain attacked the village, what did they do to protect it? What did Danzo do? Oh yes, Danzo hid so he could blame the destruction of the village on Tsunade so he could become the Hokage himself. That is textbook propaganda. And Koharu and Homura, they both blamed Tsunade for the destruction the village faced, despite her being the only one out of them that tried to do anything to protect the villagers. That is also propaganda. And they gave leeway for Danzo to become the Hokage. And by the way, Danzo bringing up the fact that Pain was a student of Jiraiya and that's why they shouldn't go with Kakashi as Hokage, because Kakashi, like Jiraiya, followed the third's teachings, despite the fact that it was Danzo's foreign meddling in the Rain Village that radicalized Pain against Konoha. That too is propaganda. Heck, one could even call the curse of hatred that Tobirama fabricated to vilify the Uchiha clan as anti-Uchiha propaganda, as we've seen members of the clan like Shisui and Sarada awaken the Mangekyo and not become completely consumed by hatred. The Leaf Village itself was founded on this type of hardcore nationalist beliefs and ideals, and those that had empathy like Hashirama or Naruto or Sakumo were seen as fringe or naive by those that surround them. And now the narrative tries to hide this bias by trying to justify Danzo and the elders' actions by saying, oh, they were just trying to protect the village, and they even had the gall to give Danzo a somewhat redeemable death, as if he wasn't the biggest fucking scumbag. Anyways, it really is interesting how Kishimoto created such a detailed world that we were kinda able to see through the propaganda of the main storyline with the extra details provided. Now, if you've enjoyed today's topic, then boy do I have the playlist for you. You'll find all my videos that go over the darkness of the Leaf Village and the shinobi system as a whole in my Duality of the Village playlist. Anyways, this has been the Konoha Propaganda Exposed. I'll see you guys in the next video, and peace out.